before. Take our hands and lead us. Fill our hearts and souls with all you know. The key to understanding.
Great. Today I'm so excited because we are actually talking about Native American cultures and Native American tribes of the Northeast. And guess where we all live? We live in the Northeast. So a lot of these different tribes that we're talking about are still in existence right in our backyard. They are the ones that are closest to us. So a lot of these names are going to sound familiar. We're going to hear all about, we live in Onondaga County. We're going to learn about the Onondaga tribe. So I'm really excited because this is actually something that is right here in our lives right now. So this read aloud, again, is all about the Native Americans of the Northeast. So here's the read aloud. The journey for some Native people took them to the northeastern part of America, to the abundant leafy woodlands and deep, dark forest that stretched from Canada and the Great Lakes to the south, to the Carolinas, and from the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast west to the Mississippi River. This was a time long before Europeans came and made their mark upon this land. This was a time when some Native people made the forest their home and lived in long-term balance with their environment. Unlike in the Southwest, rain fell, as it still does, more frequently upon most of this land. The Native people of this region do not believe there was a need to call upon the assistance of gods for rain to soak the earths and make the crops grow. And just as today in this region of the eastern woodlands, each season brought with it different climate and a changing earth. The same freshwater rivers and lakes, the same imposing mountains and forests, color the landscape today as they did back then. As you have already learned, some of the earliest people to settle across the region were the mound builders, whose culture lasted for thousands of years. They spread out from the Mississippi River and lived on the surrounding land, hunting in the forest and utilizing the abundant natural resources available to them. The people who settled in this area are known as Eastern Woodland Indians. Hundreds of years of nomadic existence, other groups of people bound by family connections form themselves into tribes. In fact, the Eastern Woodland Indians were made up of numerous tribes. Some of these tribes included the Iroquois, the Mohican, and the Powhatan. Over time, these tribes established their own cultural identities, which included a range of languages spoken throughout this large area. The Eastern Woodland Indians often interacted with each other. Sometimes their interactions were peaceful. At other times, they were not. These tribes relied on land for their very existence. They guarded their villages, their hunting lands, their crops, and their settlements from invasion by neighboring tribes. Some scientists believe that wars may have been the result of an area around 500 to 1,000 years ago when the climate changed considerably. A harsh mini ice age swept across the world. This occurred thousands and thousands of years after many scientists think Berinia crossing took place. During this time when food was scarce, it was difficult to survive. Tribal wars broke out and brought about the death of many young warriors and the destruction of tribal villages. Finally, in search of peace, these tribes joined together to form the Iroquois Nation, also called the Iroquois Confederacy. As they negotiated or discussed how they would live peacefully together, they often smoked a peace pipe. And again, you can see that in the picture right here. As you have heard, Iroquois did not call themselves by this name. They called themselves Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse. The Iroquois people were actually 5 separate tribes: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Seneca, and the Cayuga, that inhabited a particular part of the eastern woodland region. They lived largely in what is now New York and Ohio. Once a year, sachems or chiefs from each tribe, who were always men, but always chosen by women, would meet in a council to make new laws and deal with any new problems that arose. As with the native people, landscape helped to influence and shape the culture. It greatly influenced what kinds of houses they built, what clothes they wore, what food they ate, how they traveled, what weapons they had, what tools they used, what gods they worshipped, and even what language they spoke. A typical home for many eastern woodland Indians depended more on climate and available resources than anything else. The 3 most familiar kinds of homes across the Northwest region were the longhouse, the wigwam, and the round-roofed clay pole structure. Because the winter months were generally cold, with deep snow covering much of the ground, many eastern woodland Indians, including the Iroquois, constructed wigwams and longhouses. Wigwams were rounded structures that looked similar to wooden igloos and were homes in which individual families lived. The longhouse and the wigwam were made most entirely from wood. In the colder regions of the north, especially around the Great Lakes, native people constructed wigwams that could be easily dismantled so that the tribes could, for part of the year, live a nomadic life. During this time of year, they followed the herds they hunted for their survival. To build a wigwam, young trees were cut down and bent over to form a rounded frame. Tree bark was placed over the frame. Grasses were then added to help insulate the home. A small hole in the roof allowed smoke from the fire inside to escape. The family cooked their food on an open fire and slept on mats. In the winter time, they used animal furs to keep themselves warm. Longhouses were much larger than wigwams and were home to several families that were related to each other. They considered themselves to be related to each other through the mothers in their tribes. The extended family group was called a clan. Each clan had an animal name. When a young couple were married, they went to live with the bride's family. Some longhouses ranged in size from 50 feet to 150 feet long and housed as many as 50 people. Can you guys imagine that? 50 people, that'd be like the entire 3rd grade, a little bit more. That's pretty much 3rd grade living together in one spot. That's a lot. To construct a longhouse, once again, a frame was used using our young trees. Bark was placed over the frame and then was sewn together. The longhouse had a large central hallway with rooms on either side. The family members slept on sleeping platforms. Some Iroquois still build longhouses today for ceremonies. Just like other tribes, the Iroquois made baskets and pots in which to store food. Iroquois grew different varieties of corn and beans. They also grew squash, sunflowers, and tobacco. They cleared the land of trees and shrubs, and they planted their crops. Corn, beans, and squash were particularly important crops, and the Iroquois referred to them as the 3 sisters. Like members of a family, the 3 plants helped each other grow. By planting these 3 plants together, the Iroquois relied on the natural relationships among these plants. The corn stalks provided a support for the bean plants, which would wind around the corn stalks. The squash leaves that lay on the ground prevented weeds and increased the amount of rainwater that was absorbed into the soil. Also, the bean plant produced a natural bacteria that made the soil more fertile for the corn and the squash plants. In the wintertime, when food was scarce, many Iroquois left their villages to hunt. They moved with the herds and often did not return to their villages until early spring. The Iroquois hunted deer using bow and arrows. Young boys cloaked themselves in deerskin as they stealthily crept through the forest in pursuit of their prey. They also hunted smaller mammals, setting traps to catch them. In addition, the Iroquois fished and gathered berries and tapped trees to get maple syrup. Yes, the Iroquois had a sweet tooth too. Like many other tribes, Iroquois lived near water. Water was a source of life, and it provided the means of transportation. The Iroquois traveled in dugout canoes. They fished using nets and traps. Depending on the weather, the Iroquois wore a range of clothing. In summer, the men wore a breechcloth, which was a short piece of buckskin. Women wore dresses made of grass fibers. In the wintertime, everyone relied on animal furs to keep warm. Men also wore buckskin moccasins on their feet. And again, you can see that right here in the picture. So they use these dyes, beads, and quills to decorate their clothes as well as their skin. And again, if you take a look at these pictures, these illustrations, you can really see it. That they tended to decorate their clothes with these beautiful patterns and designs. Very important to the Iroquois is something called a wampum. Wampum was an artistic way of communicating important thoughts and decisions. Wampum was belts and necklaces made from colored shells. The color and design of the beads could tell a story, and they could also be a symbolic means of communication. Wampum could also be used when trading. It was therefore a kind of currency. Wampum was considered to be valuable and was an important part of the Iroquois culture. Up here you can see it almost looks a little bit like a storyline. And this is an especially interesting picture because down here you have the symbol of the Haudenosaunee people with the 5 different tribes on it. And again, if you drive around the area, you may see this in different buildings on the front of them. I know I've seen a few times when I've even driven into work, and you can see this exact symbol. And it's really interesting to know what it stands for. So these are really fascinating things. And again, they used them to tell stories, to show whose was what, and they became, like I said, currency, which means they were worth trading with something else. It was almost like a monetary thing, a money thing for them. So again, it took a lot of time to make these and a lot of patience, and they really are pretty beautiful, but they do, again, sometimes tell stories. The Iroquois, like many other eastern woodland Indians, believed in a spirit world that was governed by the Great Spirit. For the Iroquois, the Great Spirit was called Arenda. They also believed in an evil spirit, too. The Iroquois believed that everything had a spirit and that all living things on earth were connected. They believed that it was their responsibility to care for the earth. Each season brought with it its special Iroquois ceremonies. The Iroquois had shamans, or holy men. It was believed that shamans could communicate with the spirit world. Shamans were thought to have special powers. Now, they were able to do things such as cure the sick, bring about a good harvest, or bring victory to the tribe that was going to war. And so, the Iroquois, as well as Eastern Woodland Indians, lived out their lives in this way. They told stories and celebrated their history. They worshiped the Great Spirit, and they lived in harmony with the lands and all living creatures. Today, many Iroquois continue to follow and honor their traditional ways. Amazingly, some still build longhouses for ceremonies, and their leaders meet to guard and protect their ancient culture. So again, guys, just make sure that you guys are realizing that this is something that you can still see today. We can still see a lot of traditional aspects to these Native American tribes that are around us today. And if you ever get a chance, if you go to the state fair, there's something called the Indian Village, where if you go, you can see them still doing these dances. And in fact, I'm fairly sure that kind of looks like the building from the New York State Fair, where you can go and see them, with these traditional dances, their traditional clothing, different foods. So that's something you can go see that's open to the public for people to go and check out. But again, make sure you guys, if you want to, you can look at YouTube videos of different dances that we can put at the end of these videos as well to see. But this is something that is very close to where we are right now. So take the time to just kind of look around, see if you see any of this in the area around you. And I will see you guys tomorrow, and I'm so excited because we're going to keep talking all about this. So have a great night.
Hey,